Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans. Today we have something really exciting in store for you because we're talking about the Formula One of the future. It sounds a bit abstract, but the opposite will be the case. We're taking a very detailed look at what Formula One will look like in 2026. Somehow you get the feeling that we are only at the beginning of a new era, the ground effect era. We've only just seen 2 seasons, but the FIA is already focusing on the next era, namely 2026. It's been clear for a year, or just over a year, what the engines will look like. And that's a crucial point, because at the beginning of the current era, the engines didn't change at all, they were adopted one-to-one. But there were major changes to the chassis. In 2026, we will see changes on both sides, and the chassis changes are largely a consequence of the engine changes. And that's why we want to remind ourselves of the engines and what will change, so that we can then understand everything else. The basic architecture of the engine remains the same. 1.6-liter V6 turbo engines. If you look at it, you won't see any major changes. Apart from the fact that the MGUH, the motor generator unit heat, which is the electrification of the turbocharger, is missing. It makes the engine less efficient, but also somewhat simpler in terms of technology, and thus enables newcomers, for example Audi or Red Bull powertrains, to build this engine a little better. At the same time, however, the MGUK, the electric motor that sits on the crankshaft and delivers e-power to the rear axle, if you like, will be significantly more powerful. 120 kilowatts, 163 horsepower, you always want the horsepower figures, is the maximum it can currently produce. In 2026, that will be 350 kilowatts, i.e. 475 HP, which is roughly a tripling of power. At the same time, of course, the combustion engine will lose some of its weighting. That system performance would be nice, but unfortunately we're not at wishful thinking. The combustion engine currently delivers something over 550 kilowatts, i.e. more than 750, almost 800 HP or even more than 800 HP in some cases, which will be drastically reduced in 2026, of course, via the fuel flow, then only about 400 kilowatts, i.e. around 550 HP. The system output will even increase very slightly, but the weighting between e-power and the combustion engine will change dramatically. Currently, e-power accounts for around 20% of the system output, and by 2026 it will account for 45%. However, the battery capacity remains the same, and you're already thinking, okay, how is that supposed to work? Will the cars really only be able to call up maximum power for a very, very short time? How will the speed profile change? And that's a very interesting point that Max Verstappen and Christian Horner have already addressed this season. Max Verstappen was a bit disappointed after the first drives in the simulator, and when I say disappointed, that's a massive understatement. He has already railed against the new regulations. He says it has relatively little to do with Formula One. He has to downshift on the straights. You no longer have to brake properly for a corner because you just roll into it. The speed profile, anyone who followed the LMP1 a few years ago will know this very well. Of course, the electric power is boosted at the start of the straights because that's lap time optimized use of energy, and Christian Horner has said that we're creating Frankenstein's monster. We absolutely have to change something in the power unit regulations. Now we have to give more combustion power, reduce a bit of electric power so that the split is right again, so that we don't have such excesses. Nicolas Tombazis, the FIA Formula One boss, has taken a close look at this, and he has spoken to us several times recently. We sat down with him in Abu Dhabi and then at the FIA Gala in Baku, where he revealed some really interesting new details about the 2026 regulations. And of course, it was precisely about these statements by Max Verstappen and Christian Horner. He believes that these statements were somewhat premature because they knew that if you took this engine as it was specified and installed it in a current car, then of course the energy would run out at some point at the end of the straight. That wouldn't work. But from the very beginning, we had in mind that the chassis regulations would also be changed. And the chassis regulations are now a consequence of the engine regulations. I said that the engine regulations have been in place for over a season or over a year. We're already at version 5, but with the chassis regulations, we're at version 0. There are still no complete regulations. They want to have them by the end of June 2024, at least the first version. But we already know some of the details that will most likely come from the architecture. Nicolas Tombazis has now revealed this to us. So what will it look like so that the cars at the end of the straights are as fast as they are now? So that the drivers don't have to downshift. This will mainly be regulated by air resistance. Clearly, the cars will have less downforce than at present. But at the same time, they will also have less drag. In other words, it's all about aerodynamic efficiency. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's also about the dimensions. We'll take a closer look at these in a moment by having less air resistance. That's a crucial element in electric cars, why they are shaped the way they are. You have to make much better use of energy than with combustion engines. At the same time, there are active aerodynamics. Now, some people say, wait a minute, we already have active aerodynamics in the form of DRS. Yes, but that's silly compared to what will come in 2026. Because DRS, the rear wing, in other words, the drag reduction system, I'm only allowed to use that either in qualifying in certain zones or in the race when I'm a second behind the car in front so that I can overtake better. In the 2026 Formula One season, this will really be built into the car concept. That means I will be able to adjust several things, the front wing, the rear wing, and perhaps other elements. We'll talk about that later, so that the cars simply have less drag on the straights. Of course, less drag means they need less energy to reach a higher speed. Nicolas Tombazis says that all in all, you end up with a very similar speed profile to the current crop of Formula One cars. In other words, the drivers are still challenged. They still have to find the right braking point. They really have to hit the carbon brakes hard to slow the car down, so you can't lift and coast and roll around all the time. And Nicolas Tombazis, the FIA's head of Formula One, is also certain that the combination of these engines and these chassis regulations will mean that you won't reach top speed in the middle of the straight and then just coast along. No, even in the 2026 Formula One season, the top speeds will be reached immediately before the braking zone. I've already spoken to Max Verstappen about exactly that. His initial criticism and whether anything has changed in the meantime, you can read the interview in our new print edition, issue 94, and Max Verstappen says no, nothing has really changed for him. And very interestingly, he still has a contract until 2028, but he also says that if it turns out the way he thinks it will, then that could be a fundamental part of his decision for 2028 and beyond. So possibly a very, very early end to his career. Tough stuff from Max Verstappen. You can read all about it in the new print edition in a very, very interesting interview with the three-time Formula One world champion from Red Bull Racing. We have now discussed one topic, the aerodynamics, drag reduction. But you always have to look at a Formula One car as a whole. The reduction in drag somehow leads to an overall reduction in weight. And that's something we really like to hear. When Fernando Alonso drove in Formula One for the first time, the cars weighed 600 kilograms, including the driver. Today, it is 798 kilograms, so a third more weight. For the first time in over 40 years, the car weight will be drastically reduced again in Formula One in 2026. And that's really great news, because when we look at the old footage of the 600 kilogram cars, including the driver, they just look really agile and aggressive. You can see how they move. The current cars are really extremely stable and therefore don't look particularly fast. The drivers hate weight anyway, and that's why it's great news that the 2026 Formula One cars are going to be lighter. Why have cars become so heavy in the first place? And how can they be made lighter again? On the one hand, of course, the power unit. Hybridization, as you can see in road traffic, is the #1 weight driver. Then there's safety, of course. The safer the cars became, the heavier they became. New elements were constantly being added, whether it was tethers, i.e. retaining tethers for the tires or for the wheels, for example, or of course halo. All of this has made the cars heavier. But now you know that the engines are here to stay. They're even getting a bit heavier, not lighter. Safety is not negotiable with the FIA. So how are the cars supposed to become lighter? and significantly lighter at that. The aim is to save 40 to 50 kilograms. This is all to be achieved through the dimensions. In terms of dimensions, we are talking about the wheelbase on the one hand. The current cars are S classes, if you want to use Mercedes terminology. We want to move back towards the C class, ideally perhaps even an A class. Wheelbases were already shrunk a little in 2022. Currently, we still have a maximum of 360 centimeters, i.e. 3 meters 60. All teams are actually geared towards this maximum. In 2026, that will be 3 meters 40, so we've already saved 20 centimeters. And length is, of course, also weight. The width of the vehicles has been 2 meters since 2017. We are now taking a small step back again, but not quite so drastically to 180 centimeters, but to 190 centimeters. At the same time, the monocoque will also be a little more delicate. After all, the dimensions have been increasing again and again in recent times. Of course, on the one hand, because of safety, but we are sure that safety can also be packed into more compact dimensions. There are so-called AA, BB, and CC levels, and I hope that they will be a little more aesthetic again. If you shrink it all down, then you can imagine that you have less surface area in the wind. It's always a combination of surface area and CW value, i.e. the shape, when it comes to air resistance. And of course, you want to work on both fronts. The dimensions are, of course, the surface area that is in the wind. The CW value is the aerodynamics, active aerodynamics, and so on, which we have just talked about. A crucial factor in the 2026 cars is the wheels or the tires. We went from 13-inch to 18-inch in 2023. Now we're going backwards. It will most likely be 16 inches in 2026. When it comes to overheating, we actually thought that the larger tires would make things much better, but nothing has really changed. This is due to the fact that the cars have become significantly heavier and generate an incredible amount of downforce. That will be different in 2026. The cars will be lighter and have less downforce, which means that the forces on the tires will naturally be significantly lower, and it is hoped that the tires will no longer have such a tendency to overheat. At the same time, there is also a slightly different aerodynamic concept. We're talking about in-wash, so if you look at the front wing, a large part of the air is no longer directed around the outside of the front tire. This also has something to do with the fact that it should be easier to follow again. A big step has already been taken in 2022, but it's not perfect yet. The next step is to be taken with the in-wash aerodynamic concept, which will also improve the airflow and cooling of the tires. The aim is to kill two birds with one stone. Now we have less weight, less downforce, a smaller wheel tire combination. Of course, this allows you to save weight again, including on the suspensions, which no longer have to be so massive. The forces are significantly lower. And then, if you like, you set a positive vicious circle in motion, which is why the cars can actually lose these 40 to 50 kilograms. Of course, it won't be easy, because if it had been easy, it would have been done a long time ago. Weight is simply bad in motorsport. It has to be said quite clearly. But the FIA says, yes, we have now found various measures, and then we will really stick to this weight, because that has been a big problem in recent times. Whenever something came up again, then there was another safety device, then another wheel tether, then the teams negotiated again, then they said, wait, then we have to go up another kilogram with the minimum weight, then somehow a sensor is added, then the tires get heavier again, and then we can install another strut, then we want to have an extra 1, 2, 3 kilos. No, Nicolas Tombazis says quite clearly that we will stick to this weight, even if not everyone will achieve it. It's supposed to be a lightweight challenge and therefore non-negotiable. We're sticking to it, and so we hope that everything will go down. So no more concessions on that front. Now we've learned a lot about this car, but what about overtaking? The basic concept, the ground effect, remains. A lot of energy was put into the development of the 2022 car, and it definitely got better, but it's not perfect yet. We have now also seen that it has become a little more difficult to overtake in 2023. But there won't be any more adjustments until 2025. They won't come until 2026, including with in-wash instead of out-wash and so on, but also with the DRS. DRS, what will that look like in 2026? If we already have active aerodynamics, there's no point in adjusting the rear wing to overtake if the car in front can do the same. In fact, that's quite an interesting thing to look at. Ideally, of course, you wouldn't need DRS at all. But will the FIA succeed? Well, they are not quite sure themselves, and that's why they're looking at other measures to ensure that overtaking is getting much easier. There was a headline that was started by Ross Brawn, the former Formula One boss on the commercial side. It has to be said he is no longer in office. And he said that you could slow down the car in front by having to adjust the car aerodynamically so that it is not optimal. It's all nonsense, says Nicholas Tombazis. That wouldn't work, and there are no such plans. You don't want to slow down the car in front. The active aerodynamics could be a bit more extreme when driving behind, for example. I spoke earlier about front wing and rear wing adjustment. You could also adjust the beam wing, for example. You could adjust parts of the diffuser, so there's a whole lot. At the same time, of course, you can also do something about the engine. Push to pass comes to mind, i.e. you can call up a little more power in the short term when you are driving behind. This can be done using electrical energy, for example, but then again, the question is, where does it come from? You could also increase the fuel flow for a short time. There are numerous possibilities. And when overtaking, we can, of course, also think of the slipstream effect, which has become a bit less with the 2023 generation. And when you hear that the cars are becoming more delicate and have less air resistance, you would think that the slipstream effect is also getting smaller. At least that's what I thought, but Nicholas Tombazis explained to me that no, the current simulations even assume that the slipstream effect will increase and that this should help a little. But with all the measures they are looking at, they also want to make sure that overtaking is not just a matter of passing on the straight, which is not particularly exciting. That is also the big criticism of DRS, but they want to see where the overtaking maneuvers are exciting. And you could also imagine simply setting the wings or aero elements steeper in the corners in order to have more downforce. There are many, many possibilities, and you want to choose the best one. They want to have more information by June, by the end of June 2024. I'm sure they'll give us 1 or 2 more updates before then. I'm curious to see what you think of the concept for 2026 so far. Feel free to write it in the comments. And the whole thing, the criticism, that's what Max Verstappen did. We've already said that the answer or the continuation of it can be found in our new print issue. If you don't want this print magazine for yourself, but perhaps want to give it to someone as a present, then there is, of course, the option of a gift subscription, especially before Christmas. Simply go to goodshine.motorsportmagazine.com. We have, of course, also linked the whole thing for you, and then you can give your loved ones a great present for Christmas. Very important at this point. I know I'm repeating myself. Anyone who has seen our last videos has probably heard this too often, but they've already got the present anyway. You're not giving it forever. The gift subscription is really only for 1 year, and that's the difference to the normal subscription. You have to actively cancel it if you no longer like it. The gift subscription expires automatically after 1 year, and after 1 year you can give your loved ones a gift voucher again. That's actually the good thing. If you buy a gift voucher now, you've already got a gift for next year when you can buy another voucher. That's pretty clever.